Okay, now we've got soils all the way, we've got climate all the way, we've got great growing areas of California roughly all the way. We got to get around to planting a vineyard. So your reading assignment now is chapter 10, which is establishing the vineyard. Chapter 10 on page 190, and that's what we're going to cover roughly this morning, but you better cover it in detail in the reading. That's a warning. Page 190, chapter 10. We will have lab this afternoon, although they claim that we have a 50-50 chance of rain. It's not supposed to be a hard rain. So whoever's complaining last time in tennis shoes, wasn't warned about it, is warned now. If he doesn't want to wear tennis shoes, he better wear boots. Okay, one of the things which Dr. Alley didn't quite have time to summarize and finish up is what to plant. And of course, the best thing to plant are rootings, are rooted vines. And this isn't too bad if you're planting an own-rooted vineyard, aside from nematodes, that is, without rootstock. Own-rooted vines, of course, give you a much higher take. You should get about 98 or 99% stand. And they, of course, they grow earlier and more rapidly and give you better vines. And you've heard me say that the more roots that you can permit, the greater length of roots that you can permit on it, depending on your cost of planting, the better off you are. But some people cut them back to about an inch or a half an inch and then ram them into the soil with hydraulic holes. Others use shovels and can plant them with 6 inches or so of roots. You can plant cuttings, on-rooted cuttings, or cuttings which are going to be on-rooted. But remember that you may only get about a 90% take, and unless you do an exceptionally good job of taking basal cuttings, taking good care of them, planting them properly, irrigating them in, and so on. So generally from cuttings, you can really figure on getting about a 90% stand at best. And you say, well, what's wrong with 90%? Well, 90% leaves you 10% that you've got to play with for as an off-year a group of vines for the next several years till you get them up. And this can sometimes add up to quite a bit of cost. So you can plant cuttings, you can plant rootings, you can plant bench grafts. The only thing that we say don't do is don't plant in the vineyard. Now we're not talking about nursery at all, we're talking about vineyard. In the vineyard, don't plant cuttings of rootstocks. Plant rootings of rootstocks, but don't plant cuttings of rootstocks, because most of our rootstocks will only root about 50 to 60 or 70%. And if you're stuck with a situation with that type of percentage, then you're going to lose money. So if you're going to have rootstocks, then most certainly plant rootings that you grew in the previous year in a nursery. But you can sometimes, in some situations, plant cuttings of the variety itself. That confusion? If you're going to plant Cabernet in a new area where you can plant on its own roots, you might get away with planting cuttings. But if you're going to plant Cabernet in Napa Valley, you don't want to plant St. George cuttings in the vineyard and hope to get a high enough percentage take to make it economical. You must plant rootings.
What would be the highest percent take rootstock?
I don't know, unless it might be 1613. Do you know, Mark, at all? Ali's our expert, and he's not here. Of the rootstocks, I would guess 1613 is probably your best. But they vary from Dog Ridge and Salt Creek at about 50 or 60%. St. George ought to be your highest. I should have said that in the first place, because you can throw those cuttings down on the ground, walk off and leave them, and they'll root. So St. George is down to your highest. But 1613 should be close behind it. So that's the situation then on your planting material. Okay, now, we discussed last time these grape growing areas of California. And we talked about regions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you heard a lot of my sarcastic criticism of the situation. I'm the only one that can make it. You can't. You'll get in trouble. But anyway, we have 500,000 acres of grapes now, really 600,000. But if we wanted to in California, we could plant 2 million acres of grapes. We've got enough land that's being planted to barley, pasture land, so that if the market warrants it in the next 15 or 20 years, we could go to 2 million. As I sometimes tell people, and they won't believe me, that you can name any crop that's grown in the United States except perhaps cranberries and give the California the market incentive, and we'll put it into surplus. But people don't believe that. They don't believe California. I gave a talk to growers on Friday or Thursday in Modesto, and I was telling about my experience in North Carolina, in which these growers were all belly aching and moaning about their competition with California. And I said, if you guys want competition, I'll just drop 50 California growers from an airplane over your state tonight and let them fade into the landscape, and then you'll get some competition. We have the soil, we have the know-how, and we have growers who know how. And we can put any crop that they want to bring along into overproduction within 2 or 3 years if they'll give us enough money. And we can do it with grapes. As I say, we've got 500,000. We can quadruple that if we want to. We've got that whole west side of the San Joaquin Valley, 300,000 acres that can go into grapes. We've got all of that area from Davis to Shasta Dam that can go into grapes if the price is there. So those are the two big new areas in which we can grow grapes. This west side of the San Joaquin Valley, but remember what I've told you about it, that it's high in sodium, chloride, and boron. And remember what I've told you about the area from Davis to Shasta Dam, that you get early fall rains and these strong north winds. But if the price is okay, we can grow grapes there. And a lot of you, though, are going to be looking and should be looking at a lot of these little 10 and 20 acre valleys that are nestled all the way from Ukiah to Santa Barbara, whereas Dr. Leiter says he's going to pick out one and retire on. There are places where you can grow 5, 10, 20, 40 acres of grapes, and these ought to be looked at. But okay, so much then for the overall. We get down now, we're right down to the nitty-gritty. We're going to plant this land. One of the things, not one of the things, but many of the things that people don't look at are the details, which sometimes are so obvious you overlook them. If the land's already been cleared, and most of the land in California has now, one of the most important things to do first is get rid of all the rodents, the gophers and squirrels and mice. And it's better to do these before you plant than after. One of the 2 or 3 times that I was down in the Bonnie Doon area, I was with Dr. Winkler where we looked at a vineyard that was having problems. And it was only having problems because there's an average of about 1 gopher per grapevine. And it's an old vineyard, and I really mean it had just about 1 gopher hole per grapevine. And the big problem then was just get rid of gophers. And for this, the best thing to do in each area, and the best thing to do in each area regardless of what we're talking about, is to go talk to the farm advisor in that county. That's what he's paid for. He can't tell you whether or not you ought to pay $2,000 for this land or $1,000 for this land, because he can get in trouble. But he can tell you what's wrong with this land. So he can't tell you what to pay for it, but he can tell you what's wrong with it. So certainly you ought to see your farm advisor about any piece of land you're going to contemplate buying, and you ought to see him about getting the latest information on how to get rid of the animal pest, and at the same time how to get rid of the weed and grass pest in the area. Now, generally speaking, in California, we really only have about 4 real main weed pests. And they're Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, morning glory, and puncture vine. Now, those are common names, and because we have several foreign students, we got to put on the scientific name. Bermuda grass in Mexico is called chino, and its scientific name, and you don't have to know these at all, it's just for the foreign students who have to know the international language. This is Bermuda grass. Say, I do know the name of it in Mexico. I do know it in Chile. It's Chapica in Chile. Okay? Is that what it's called, hey?
Yes.
Okay. Got it right. And then we have Johnson grass, which is probably the worst thing that ever hit the Western Hemisphere. Johnson grass, if you've been to Mexico, if you've been up and down the San Joaquin Valley, you've seen plenty of it. And it's called, what is it called? I don't have its formal name. Is Chapica Johnson grass or Bermuda?
Bermuda.
It is? Well, then my notes are wrong, because I have it listed as Johnson grass. And then we have the morning glory. And this is a little bit confusing sometimes, because we're not talking about annual, we're talking about perennial. And the perennial is convolvulus arvensis. But it's a perennial weed. The annual morning glory that makes those beautiful, nice blue blossoms that are about this big around that you see on some people's fences and so forth is an annual. And it's a problem in Mexico, even the annual. But it can be wiped out. But of course, the morning glory that we're talking about is this beautiful white flower that you see on between here and Napa Valley, starting in about next month. My wife says, "What's wrong with that? That's a beautiful looking flower." I'm going to ask you what's wrong with it on the midterm. That's a promise. And then we have puncture vine, and I don't think there's point putting the name on that, because I don't think it's very common in the world, or is it? Do you have the puncture vine? Do you? Do you, Jorge? Do you have the puncture vine? Well, I'll write the name then. Okay. That's what puts flat tires on boys' bicycles. The puncture vine. Do you know about that name? You do have it? Yeah. Okay.
The scientific name for Johnson grass is sorghum halibut.
Is that right? I ought to have it here. Sorghum what? Well, I've got it here somewhere. I saw it earlier. I don't see it, but I did have it earlier. Sorghum what? Halepins. Yeah. Hal E. Well, somewhere I've got it, but I can't see it on my notes. Because I remember it now, but okay. So these are the main things. Now, Bermuda grass and Johnson grass, it's better to wipe them out, of course, obviously, before you plant. And I say these things are so obvious, it's no point in talking about them, but people foul up on them. I know one big grower that had a big block of grapes that was going out between virus and Bermuda grass. So he pulled up the whole block, and he couldn't wait 1 year to wipe out the Bermuda grass with herbicides. He went right back in and planted young cuttings or young rootings, and then still has the same problem he had before. Now you say, how can a guy be that dumb? Well, that's the way sometimes people are. So the thing to do is, before you plant, wipe out especially Bermuda grass and Johnson grass, even if you have to lose a year. Now, sometimes it isn't as stupid as you think, because you know, one of the oddities of our tax laws are that if you today, right this morning at 12 o'clock, buy a chunk of land that's invested with Bermuda grass and Johnson grass, and you decide you're going to spend all this year wiping it out and then plant next year, you're going to pay a fantastically high income tax. But if you rush out and plant it next month, then you can wipe out most of all of the planting preparation and costs and the cost of vines and everything else, wipe it off as income tax deductible. You all sit here and nod. You didn't know that. But that's what causes some people to rush out and plant too early. The fact that for some unknown reason, see, whatever crop you've got in the ground in this calendar year, you can deduct the cost for. But if you don't have the crop in the ground, no matter how much work you're going to prepare the soil for next year, you cannot deduct $1 of that. Oh, it's just cost of, it comes off the cost of the production of the crop or something. But when I heard about this, I went off, I really blew my top. Hmm?
You can recapture that in succeeding years.
Yeah, but you can't recapture it next year. I don't know when you can, but that's one of the reasons why some of these big companies rush out and plant without adequate preparation of the soil. And Leiter and I got involved in this on a consultation deal, and we managed to hit them over the head hard enough that they decided to spend 1 year wiping out a terrific crop of Johnson grass and Bermuda grass so that they could start out properly. And that's what reminded me of it. Okay, you have these in. I don't want to go too much into weed control now, because later on I'll give you a whole lecture. I'm just trying to sort of give you an overall here. But Bermuda grass can be wiped out before planting with repeated cultivation of dry soil, and with the use of Dalapon and MSMA, and one that isn't at the moment qualified for vineyards, but should be qualified all right for bare land, is something called Roundup. Isn't that a name? But those materials will wipe out Bermuda and Johnson grass, the two of them together. But we like the idea of flooding or dry cultivation, repeatedly dry cultivating. But if you want to use these herbicides, you've also got to irrigate, because the whole secret is to get the grass growing real nice and luxuriant, like it didn't have a worry in the world, and then slap it. And if it's just sitting there stunted and barely growing, and you put on these herbicides, they don't do too much. You got to get them growing like they thought they were the next lawn or the next golf course, and then hit them. Well, that may be funny, but that's what happens. Okay, of course, morning glory. Here, the standard procedure is 2,4-D. And again, it's very important to wipe it out before you start the vineyard, because 2,4-D really works on morning glory, but it really works better on grapevines. So they have, for example, in established vineyards, even have big wax bars that are about 3 or 4 inches square and about this long, and you drag them. They're impregnated with 2,4-D to keep the vape and keep it from getting on the vines. And that seems far out, but you also work out sprayers that have all kinds of drapes over them, and just are draped so that none of the vapor or mist can get onto the vines. But they have trouble with 2,4-D injury. For example, the worst places in Lodi, where they get a little bit of damage from 2,4-D, where they use airplane sprays 15 or 20 miles to the west on grain fields. And you get a little, the wind just the right direction, you get a little drift over and you get some damage. Just for record, we have shown pretty well that the injury from 2,4-D is just about the amount of injury you get from the reduced leaf surface. And the reduced leaf surface isn't so terrible, but the symptoms look bad. And these growers just go into all sorts of conniption fits when they see a little leaf symptoms on their vines. And there's all sorts of lawsuits and everything and so forth and so on. So we've been involved in it for 20 years, ever since 2,4-D came out, I guess. But the data that we have accumulated seems to indicate that the main damage that you get from 2,4-D is really approximately about what the reduction in leaf surface is. But you can't convince people of this. I told you before, when I was talking about spraying with zinc and so forth for zinc deficiency, that a little bit of burn is good, but the growers get a little bit of burn, they get excited, and they want to sue somebody. Okay, so then we get to puncture vine, and the best thing we've still had for puncture vine is just oil sprays. We just use oil sprays, sometimes what we call fortified oil sprays, and we'll go into this when we get into weed control. And that's about the best thing you can think of on this. Say puncture vine is a real flat, green growing weed with real big burrs on it that you usually see alongside the highway, and kids ride over their bicycles and get flat tires. That's why it's called puncture vine. Okay, so now you got to get rid of these animal pests. You got to get rid of these main weeds. And I cannot, once again, I cannot emphasize too strongly to get rid of these 4 in California.
You get rid of Johnson grass like Bermuda grass same way?
Yeah, same way with the same materials. Yeah.
Did you for roads?
For what?
Fill out the roads.
Well, as I say, the best thing to do is see your farm by and find out what they're recommending, because you've got all sorts of county regulations, and they don't want to kill the birds, and they don't want to kill this and so forth. So it's better to see your county farm advisor and find out exactly what he's requiring.
If 2,4-D was used in an adjacent field during, right before harvest, could this cause some kind of burn on grapes too?
Well, if it's just before harvest, that isn't when you get the damage. The damage, I mean, you might get a little bit of leaf damage, but where they really worry about the damage from 2,4-D is just about bloom time.
But it wouldn't cause a problem right on the berry.
No. Oh, I see what you mean. No, not on the berry itself. No, I see. Okay. Okay, now we got that out of the way, and we got this land. We've got the weeds out of the way. We've got we got rid of all the gophers, and we got to worry about leveling the land. And a lot of my visiting friends come from back east, and they say, "Isn't it wonderful that all of the whole San Joaquin Valley was so level?" They think it came that way. And I tell them, well, it cost a little money to level it. It didn't get leveled that way on purpose, I mean by nature. And the amount of leveling you do in an area where you're going to use surface or furrow irrigation depends pretty much on how much irrigation you're going to need. If you're down around Bakersfield or Fresno where you're going to have to put on 3 or 4 or 5 irrigations, then you better do an extremely good job. The way they do in, that's one of the things they really do well in Mexico. They wear the soil out leveling it. and they really are expert at it. They do excellent jobs. I'm not being sarcastic. I've never seen a place where they spend so much time and effort and money on and making absolutely positively they've got a beautiful leveling job or a slight grade if they need it. So it depends then on how often you need to irrigate, on how much money you're going to spend on leveling.
What about sprinkler irrigation?
We'll get to it. All these questions, so many of these questions that you've got to ask in which this short course is short can come at Monday 5 to 6 if you don't get them in class, okay? And that's one of the things I wanted to point out, that's the reason we put in that Monday 5 to 6 question period, was that we run behind on this lecture course because there's too many questions in class. So we had to put in that so the questions can come 5 to 6. Okay, now back in '67, which is the last time I checked on it, it cost 15 cents a yard to move dirt. And at that time we decided, one of the prices at that time, of course that's 6 years ago, that if you have to move more than 500 yards per acre, you might be better off to consider putting in sprinklers rather than trying to use furrow irrigation. But now I imagine moving dirt maybe, does anybody know what it costs to move dirt today? I'll ask the questions for once. Nobody knows, but it must be at least 20 cents a yard. It must have gone up to at least 20 cents a yard to move the dirt. Say part of how much soil you're going to move depends on how often you're going to irrigate, and one other point, how big the blocks are you going to have. Because if you got little small blocks, of course, you can do a lot less rearranging of the soil to get what you want. And remember, what's one of the other dangers of land leveling is the possibility of potassium deficiency, and that you've got to, if you're going to level the land and going to move as much as a foot of soil off anything, you better make a map of it at the time it's being done, so you can check potassium deficiency later on. Okay, then we get around to the land preparation itself. And remember, the vine is deep-rooted, so that you'd like to have deep soil preparation. Maybe 2 or 3 inches of topsoil, or 6 inches is good for vegetables and so on, but for vineyards where you're going to plant them, and you are going to plant them, where the roots are going to be placed about 12 or 18 inches below the surface of the soil, you need to have fairly deep preparation. And many of these soils that you run into have plow pan. And one of the questions on one of those old exams, which you did not get, because we hadn't discussed it, was the difference between plow pan and hard pan. And plow pan is man-made. And it may be at 8 inches, usually about 8 inches deep, because it's caused by a constant plowing of the soil to a certain depth, and usually with fairly heavy equipment. And then just below that depth at which you plow it, you get a heavy compacted zone. And that's physical. It's not chemical, it's physical. And it can be broken up. It can be broken up, but much of it occurs down in the Modesto and so on area. It's pretty hard to do by just plowing it up. It is by going to a little deeper plowing with a subsoil or something to break it up, because it seems to re-cement. The best way to take care of plow pan is by cover crop. And that's what I told you in class was one of the 2 reasons for cover crop was water penetration, and water penetration mainly because of plow pan problems. That is, you get surface soil here, 8 inches or so down here, you get a compacted layer. But if you get 10 trillion barley plants growing down here with their root systems, and then they decay, you plow them off and leave the root systems here, and they tend to help break it up. and we've got data I can show you, or should show you, I guess, here at Davis, where cover cropping with annual crops of that type have gradually erased plow pans which used to exist in this area. Now, hard pan's a different matter. You've been shown that, you've been told about it, and I've told you that about the only way you can, it's caused chemically, remember, by long ages of insufficient rainfall and so on. And it is so completely cemented that about the only way you can take care of it, if it's shallow enough, is to break up sections so you can take them out and ruin the continuity of it so that roots can get through below it. And you have to watch this plow pan problem in order to either you're going to have to spend several $100s per acre to take out some of it, or you have to check it and see if it's so thick that it isn't economically worthwhile to work with. I told you some growers I've seen using 2 D9s in tandem, pulling a subsoiler about 6 feet high, and I still don't see how they can make money doing that, but maybe the price of grapes has gone that high. So remember the difference between plow pan and hard pan and what the difference is. And also, just because it's one of the other obvious things that you got to remember is that when you start leveling soil, so remember that if you're up in the low foothills, you don't just level the soil and assume that you've got plenty of soil below it or that it's hard pan below it, because in those low foothills, you may have 2 feet of soil and you don't have hard pan under it, you have virgin earth, a rock, which goes on down. And if you scrape off the soil, you won't have anything underneath it, which may sound obvious, but it wasn't to this former tailor who inherited a vineyard over on the east side and wanted me to tell him what to do about it. He thought he could just level it off, and I said, you scrape off that soil and you're out of business. Okay, now, I say the depth of the preparation then. Some of you asked me the other day, well, how deep a soil do you have to have? And I think I told most of you, it depends how deep the soil has to be, depends on how frequently you have to irrigate and what water supply you got. If you really wanted to, you could grow grapes on 12 inches of soil. If your vineyard is only as big as this room, if you had a sprinkler system that could irrigate it every 3 days, but if you've got 160 acres and your irrigation facility will only irrigate 10 acres a day, then you better have about 3 feet of soil or 4 feet of soil. So it all depends on your irrigation facilities. Now, as far as depth of preparation then, we also talked about this when Dr. Alley was talking about the length of cuttings, and it depends partly on the soil you're in. If you're in this bisalular area, where we want the hard pan for good emperor quality, the soil may be only 2 feet deep or so, there's no point in cultivating it deeper than about 10 or 12 inches where you're going to put your rootings. If you're in the Cucamonga area with the sandy soils and so forth, you may want to break the soil up a little deeper. So you want to, or obviously you want to break the soil up down to the depth at which you're going to put the rootings. That's the whole point of what I'm trying to say. You want to break the soil up down to the depth at which your rootings are going to go. If they're 10-inch rootings, obviously 10 or 12 inches. If they're 18 inches, break it up to there. And the best way to do that, of course, is a subsoiler. Remember I told you about the soil. If it layers, if it has transition zones from sand to clay to silt, etc., you want to subsoil it and really spend some money to mix it up good. Some examples of the depth of preparation. In the Champagne area in France, they prepare soil 6 to 10 inches deep. In the south of France, they prepare it down to as far as 3 feet. In Portugal, they dig the soil 3 to 4 or 5, or even, according to my notes, even 6 feet deep to work up the soil for vineyards. This may sound odd, but and also in Israel, they work the soil up quite deeply. And one of the odd things about it, that much of the old world, they have such a strong feeling about this business of working up the soil, where they dig the soil out and pile it up here, and dig the soil out of here and pile it up here, and then work it up and then put it back into the holes. That this is quite often done. Dr. Winkler has seen it where he's seen as many as 40 or 50 men with shovels doing this digging. Of course, so the question is whether or not it really pays off. It takes maybe 100 or so man-hours per acre to do it. And I asked him once if he had any data on whether or not this did any good. He said no, he didn't, except that there was some feeling that the first year or two they had better aeration. You see, the belief is this, that after about 300 or 400 years of growing vines in the same place, that this topsoil has been robbed or deleted of the nutrients in it. So we take this out and put it over here, and then dig this bottom part up and put it up here, and then put this bad stuff back on the bottom, and then put this part on top, reverse it, that then we'll have good soil on top. But no, I haven't seen any data. I keep asking Winkler, where's some data to support this, and neither he nor I know of any to support it. But it's a fairly common thing. What I was going to tell you about, which is make you laugh, but it's a sad story. One year when I was talking about this in class, a student came up to me afterwards who was from Israel, and he said that he knew of a couple who were digging soil in this fashion, and the wife went to the house to cook lunch, and this guy was digging the trenches so deep that the soil caved in on him and killed her husband while she was fixing lunch, while they're fixing soil to plant vineyards. So they dig this soil this way, even though we haven't any proof that it works. So generally in California, we do just what I was talking about the nursery. The best thing to do is to plow and subsoil during the dry season, when you can get in with heavy equipment without ruining the soil structure, and plow deeply at that time so that the soil is fairly well broken up and in good shape for the following spring when you're going to just dig deep enough or subsoil enough to plant the vines. Okay, then we've got the soil, subsoil now, we're ready to plant. The question is how to plant it. We need to make a comment for just a moment on some of the planting done in some of the world in which they talk about mixed plantings, or to use a fancy word, intercalary planting, but mixed plantings. And the most common place where this is done is in Italy, where they have several crops, and the grapes and so forth are interplanted with other crops. This is usually done where land is scarce and help is plentiful, and you can plant the vines and then plant vegetable crops or annual crops between the rows. But in California, at least at the present time, our land is still not so expensive, but what it's better to plant. If you're going to plant grapes, plant grapes. If you're going to plant corn, plant corn. But it used to be that in California they would often plant the grapes like this, and then either plant a couple of rows of cotton or corn or something in between, and then the next row of grapes, just to make use of this land while the vines are young. And being an old, coming from a long line of farmers, I can't quite disagree with this. It looks odd to see little vines planted 12 feet apart, and nothing between them for a couple of years. It seems like there ought to be something planted between them. But whatever you plant between them, you ought to take into consideration two things. Really, you should not plant corn, which I've seen done, because then you don't have this situation. You have this situation with the corn up here and shading out the vines. So then you're really in trouble because you have a very high crop shading out your low crop. And it really shades it, either in the morning or the afternoon. And you don't want to plant crops that are really hosts for nematodes, like tomatoes or melons I knew one guy that spent a lot of money fumigating his sandy soil for grapes, and then he went in and planted a terrific crop of melons, which were just real nice hosts for nematodes. And I will go into all this when we get in talking about nematodes. But part of the whole philosophy of fumigating for nematodes is that you can't kill off all the nematodes. All you do is knock them in the head and really knock them way down low, and then hope the vines get ahead of them before they come back. But then you wreck the whole thing if you go in and plant a nurture crop for nematodes as an intercrop. You build them back too fast. So whether you have a high crop or a crop that encourages nematodes, those are two things that you certainly don't want to plant. Okay, I'm trying to tell you how to keep from going broke.
Are there any which won't have those problems?
Oh, you can. Yeah, there are a number of crops you can plant that won't have that problem. But come to 5 o'clock and we'll talk about them. Okay. Okay, then. All right, then we can talk about irregular plantings and all this type and so on. But we get around eventually in California, under our California system, of whether or not we're going to plant grapes on a square system, the same distance between vines. That is something like this, where we're planting, let's say, the low-die area where we plant 10 feet by 10 feet. That is 10 feet in the vine row and 10 feet between the rows. This is the square system. Or whether we go to the avenue system, which as best example is 8 feet by 12 feet. This is called the avenue system, where it's 8 feet between the vines and 12 feet between the rows. Those are the two usual systems in California. We'll get around to details of spacing in a moment, but I'm giving that an example of the so-called square system and the rectangular system. This is the square system. And this is the rectangular system. And right off the top, I'll say that we, in every case, regardless of the individual spacing between them, we recommend the rectangular system. The rectangular, or sometimes called the rectangular, or perhaps more descriptive, the avenue system, where we have the bigger driveway between the rows. And this is the most recommended and the most common in California. And generally speaking, we want this, the big thing of this rectangular system, you ought to be obvious, is that by 10 by 10, if you're trying to get through with a pickup or heavy equipment, 10 by 10 sound like a lot of space. But take this vine and let it throw out foliage to here, and then try to get through with a pickup or anything to pick up your fruit. But on an 8 by 12 system, this can throw out to here, and this can throw out to here, and you can still, sometimes perhaps a little difficult, you can still drive through every middle, even at harvest time. So on this 10 by 10, or 9 by 9, as we sometimes get in the coast county, or 7 by 7, as we sometimes get in some of the real old coast vineyards, there's no way to get through with any sort of equipment, and you just got to tote it out. You got to tote out the fruit. You can't get in late to sulfur dust, and I'll show you later how they do it by putting a backpack duster and walking through and so on. So with this wider spacing of 8 by 12, the point is this. You see, 10 by 10 gives 100 square feet per vine. 8 by 12 gives 96. There's really no difference in the space per vine or the vines per acre, but it gives you a whole lot easier way to handle equipment, pick up the fruit, et cetera, et cetera. So that the cost of cultivation is less because you got those big wide middles, you can use bigger equipment. The labor is reduced at harvesting because you can drive through and the vine sitting here, you can pick the box of grapes and set it right here and over here. And you can pick them up on these other spacings how do they do it in Lodi? They don't go through and haul them and tote them out, as I said, or carry them out. What they do is they go through about every third middle and butch them back, cut the canes off so that they can get through. And this isn't too good at about harvest time to cut off about a third or more of the leaf surface so he can get through to pick it up. But in these coastal county areas like this, or the 8x8s or the 7x8s, and the pickers have to carry the fruit out. They have to put it in a box and carry it out to the end of the vine row. And this wipes out some of the women and children as pickers, or else their husbands have to pick it up for them. So labor is reduced at harvesting because of this easy system of picking it up. The heavy equipment needed for sulfur dusting, and later on we're going to get around to spray equipment, can more easily get through these big avenues. So that in general we like the wide spacing of California. And then just one more comment, because the time's up. Our spacing in general is 8x12, 6x12, what have you. And it's worked out very nicely for our equipment. But one of the interesting things I like to point out is that the grapevine did not dictate the spacing in California. The equipment dictated the spacing, which is interesting because the first big growers in California that occupied big acreages of land were grain farmers. When they got around to planting grapes, they didn't want to ditch their equipment and go buy some little small stuff like they use in Europe. They just adapted the vineyard spacing to their equipment rather than the other way around. Okay, we'll pick up from there next time. Okay.